I'm going to share all my secrets for how you can make any pencil set produce realistic drawings so that your supplies are no longer holding you back. In fact, normally just changing one little thing will make your cheap pencils look like those really expensive pencils that you wish you had. So what is this simple trick to making cheap Crayola type pencils produce great drawings? The answer is changing your paper. So often I see artists that use cheap pencils also use that really cheap printer paper that most of us have at home. And when you use printer paper, the problem is that it's so smooth and thin. It can't handle having all that colored pencil applied to it. It can't take all of those layers because it just has no texture or tooth to actually grip onto the pencil. Now, you don't need to use anything expensive, but just using a paper that is designed for taking lots of colored pencil will make a world of difference to your drawings. And that is because drawing paper is thicker and has more of a textured surface, so it can hold more of that pencil pigment. And this means that your cheap pencils will look more vibrant on this type of paper and will actually be able to produce darker, more intense values. And because this paper can handle more layers of colored pencil, you'll be able to layer multiple colors together, which will give your drawing a more complex look and will give it more depth. And because the paper is more robust, it'll be able to handle the blending methods and other techniques that you need to use to make your colored pencil drawings look more realistic. But changing your paper isn't the only thing you can do to guarantee that you'll still be able to create really realistic drawings with your cheap pencils. So now I'm going to draw something with my set of Crayola pencils, and I'm going to talk through the 4 things to focus on when you're drawing with cheap pencils to guarantee you still get a realistic result. The first thing that you can do to make your drawings look really good when you're using cheap pencils is actually choose drawing techniques that will counter any weaknesses that your colored pencils have. So for example, with the Crayola colored pencils, I knew that the white pencil wasn't very good at all. It wasn't very opaque and it wasn't great at adding highlights for colored pencil drawings compared to more expensive pencils. So one of the techniques that I used to make this not so much of an issue was I used this little indenting tool to actually indent the little highlighted bits of texture that I could see in the mouth reference for the lips. So the little bits of sparkly highlights, the little bits of glitter on the lips, I just pressed wherever those highlights were, I pressed them in with this indenting tool. And that way these highlights would be preserved and I wouldn't have to worry about adding them in with a white coloured pencil. The main way that you can create a great drawing with your cheap pencils is to just focus on getting the right values and to focus on mastering your fundamentals. So I like to start with what I call a value sketch, where I use a black pencil and dark brown pencils and actually start to shade in where the different values are in my drawing, and I like to get an idea of where the darkest shadows are and then where the midtones are, and then finally I leave the highlights white so I don't add any shading to the highlights. I apply more pressure for shadow areas and then I use lighter pressure for those lighter values. And just using one colour, for example a dark brown, to establish all of your different values gives you a good idea of where those shadows are and where your darks and lights are. And this is important because having a range of values is what gives your drawing depth and makes it look really realistic. Value is so much more important than picking the perfect colours. Your colours can actually be quite inaccurate as long as your values are really accurate to the reference image. And then when I go over the top with other colours like the pinks and oranges to make the colour more closely match the reference, it's a lot easier because I've already established very early on where the different values are. I've got that structure down for my drawing from the start, which means that I'm much less likely to shade in the highlights too dark and add too much shading to those areas. And I'm less likely to leave the shadow areas too light and not make them dark enough. The third thing that you can do to make the most out of your cheap pencils is to really layer them. In this drawing, I am doing a lot of layering. I've started with that value sketch, and then over the top I layered a nice light pink as a base colour, and then I'm going in with even more intense reds to add more vibrancy to the shadow areas, and I'm even going in now with a bright orangey colour, and I'm glazing that over certain areas of the lips just to make the colour look a little more interesting. Because if you just use one or two colours that are the same sort of hue, if you're just using a variety of pinks, then the drawing can look pretty boring. But adding in colours like oranges or yellows to the lips can really give your drawing more of a realistic look, because you have more of a complexity of colours. And that's why it's so important to choose a paper that's specifically designed for drawing on, because layering is a very important part of realistic drawing, because you need to layer so many colours and get some of your values really dark. And by doing more and more layers, you will be able to get those more intense values. If you don't layer your colour pencils, then it won't even matter if you're using more expensive pencils. You won't get those vibrant colours and dark values if you're not layering, if you're not building lots of the pigment on top of each other with these different pencils to get that rich look. So what you need to do when you use cheap pencils like Crayola is make sure that you're not just using one pencil on any specific area. Your drawings will look so much better if you use 2 or 3 or 4 colours per area and layer them together. If you just use one colour on an area, you're likely to get a very flat looking drawing. It won't look very complex, and it's going to also look quite boring and very uninteresting, and it will give it that amateur look and that sort of childish appearance if you only use one colour. So try and pick multiple colours that will layer together to give you a realistic result. And the fourth thing to master is colour theory. So it is important to pick colours that are accurate to your reference. Picking accurate colours and having good values really do get you 80% of the way towards a realistic drawing. And if you pick colours that are somewhat accurate and get the values in the right place, then it won't matter if your drawing doesn't have a super polished look, if your pencils don't lay down super smooth. As long as your values are in the right place and you've got colours that somewhat match the reference, you will get a realistic look. And if you can then add a bit of detail and textures that match the reference, then that makes it even better. But that's why it's so important to know colour theory, because picking the right colours and values is a massive part of realistic drawing. And it really is important to take the time to understand how colours work together and how they influence each other. Because colour theory is an important fundamental for any medium, but especially with coloured pencils, where you have got to layer multiple colours together and try and figure out what colours you need to layer to create that perfect colour that you're looking for. And that's really what I've done here. I haven't worried about the quality of the pencils. I've just focused what's in my control, which is getting the fundamentals right. And like I said, also picking techniques that will help complement the pencils and fix any weaknesses that it has. So another weakness that these pencils had is that they don't necessarily blend super easily together. So something that you can use, that you can just buy for a couple of pounds, but will make a world of difference to your pencil drawings, but still isn't very expensive, is one of these like colourless blending pencils. And this one is by Prismacolor. And you can just use this pencil to actually smooth out all of your shading. It's just a clear pencil, it doesn't have any pigment, but the wax binder in this pencil just smooths out all of your shading and instantly gives it a more professional look. So if you was to buy one pencil that is a bit more of a premium brand, then a colourless blender is a great way to go because it can make any cheap pencils look super smooth. Focusing on learning to master these fundamentals rather than feeling limited by your cheap supplies will allow you to be able to create realistic drawings like this one. Hope you learned some new ways to create great art with your cheap pencils, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye everybody.